Hello everyone, and welcome to Ratio Christi at Western Michigan University. My name is Kevin West, and I'm the chapter director here at Western. We're here on campus for our final weekly meeting of the semester, and welcome to those of you tuning into our live stream. We are privileged to do week 3 tonight of Dr. Lydia McGrew's New Testament Reliability series she's been doing for us. Lydia is a wife and a mother. She's a widely published analytic philosopher. She's the author of 2 major works, one in 2017 called Hidden in Plain View, and that's on a thing called Undesigned Coincidences in the New Testament documents, and another in 2019 last year called The Mirror or the Mask, and that's on a topic called literary devices. We're excited and blessed to have Dr. McGrew with us. She's an excellent scholar in the field, and so I will turn it over to Lydia. And if you do have questions during the talk, please type those into the chat section on the live stream, and we'll be fielding those here and asking Lydia. At the end, there will be time for Q&A. So type your questions into the chat, and please welcome Dr. Lydia McGrew.
Thanks, everybody. Glad to be here on this last in-person meeting. My talk tonight is called Acts Gets Hard Things Right. And that phrase I have shamelessly stolen from my husband, Tim McGrew. He's the first one I recall hearing use that phrase. And I think it does really summarize the strength of Acts. Someone asked me in an interview I did recently how I would compare the strength of the historicity of Acts with the strength of the case for the reliability of the Gospels. And of course, we do have the same author of Acts and the Gospel of Luke. And so in that sense, if he's a reliable author, he's a reliable author. But what I said was that I think Acts allows Luke to show his stuff even more. That in a sense, Acts gives Luke even more opportunity. And that's partly a matter of time and partly a matter of space. Because in the book of Acts covers a much wider amount of time than the book, any of the Gospels do. The Gospels are focused on Jesus' ministry, chiefly a period of maybe 3 to 4 years. It's a very narrow window of time. And that's good in a way because we have 4 different Gospels overlapping on the same narrow window of time. But it also doesn't allow them to show off as wide a level of knowledge. Spatially, the Gospels are also very confined. They're confined to that little strip of land that was in the Roman province of Syria at the time, 1st century Palestine. Acts moves, as I also once heard Tim say, into the wider Roman world. There's so much travel that goes on in it with the travels of Paul, all over from Rome, of course in Israel, but also all the way along the edge and a lot in Asia Minor, as we'll see in our talk tonight. So that really gives the author a chance to show how careful he is and how much he knows. And it's kind of in a Goldilocks zone because the amount of space and time are such that a single individual man could encompass them in his lifetime, so that he could actually either have personally witnessed the events or maybe have spoken to people who had witnessed the events very readily. But at the same time, it's broad enough that he really gets a chance to show that he knows a lot of facts. So Acts is truly impressive, and I'm only going to be able to give you a sample tonight of the evidence for Acts. Why is Acts important to the case for Christianity? You might say, well, Jesus has already risen from the dead. Only in Acts 1 do we actually see Jesus in person, as you might say, and then he ascends into heaven. So maybe it might seem that it's not as important as the Gospels. Well, first of all, it records the conditions of persecution in the early church. When we are talking about the evidence for Christianity and the evidence for the resurrection, the fact that they were under great risk of persecution is really an important part of the evidence, because the apostles were out there. So we're going to talk about what would their motive be for lying or for making things up. when you see what was really happening in Acts when they first got up there 6 weeks after Jesus' crucifixion and started testifying he was risen from the dead, we see very clearly that they had no motive for lying. And that's important because when people found new religions, they often are. They're hoping for power or money or sex or some kind of thing that human beings want, attention or something of that kind. But we see that the attention that they got was not a kind of attention that you would want to get, and how they got themselves in trouble. So Acts is important for that. It also records the very early declarations of the resurrection coming directly from the apostles. Sometimes people will say that the thing that the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 is our earliest record of what the apostles were teaching. And I like to remind people at that point, no, Acts 2 is our earliest record of what the apostles were teaching. Even if the book of Acts was written later than the book of 1 Corinthians, the time of the event is a mere 6 weeks, approximately 40 days after Jesus' resurrection from the dead. And they're out there testifying that he's risen. So that's important because we see them, they're actually saying that he was physically risen, that his body did not rot, and so forth. We get the content. And so if Acts is reliably recording its speeches, which of course some scholars cast doubt on, but if we get the reliability of Acts, then we can say, okay, this was really their message that early. As I mentioned already, it's written by the same author as the author of Luke. So you might say that the reliability of Acts, it has kind of a backward reflection upon the reliability of Luke, because we come to know this person, we come to know this author, and we come to trust him. So who was he? Well, it really looks like he was a companion of the Apostle Paul. Now the book itself seems to make that claim, because in a couple places it even says we went here and we did that. But there's a lot more to the evidence, as you'll see in our talk tonight. A strong case composed of both external and internal evidence supports the conclusion that he knew Paul personally and he traveled with him. You remember the distinction I made a couple weeks ago? External evidence comes from facts outside of the scriptural books. Internal evidence comes from little marks within the scriptural books. My talk tonight is going to almost entirely be focused on external evidence. If we get to the bonus features, I got bonus features at the end, I might throw in one undesigned coincidence, as they're called, which is a kind of internal evidence. But do check out Hidden in Plain View, because that has an entire half of the book is on the book of Acts, and undesigned coincidences in the book of Acts. But so tonight I thought I'd do something a little different from that. If he really knew Paul and traveled with him, that would have given him a chance to talk to the apostles as well. So actually, I believe that there is internal evidence in the book of Luke that Luke spoke to Peter personally and interviewed him. This possibility was suggested in the book of Acts, in the setting of Hellenistic history by Colin Hemer, from which I got a lot of my examples tonight. He says some things about Luke there as well, even though he's mostly talking about Acts, and he makes that suggestion that Luke may have personally interviewed Peter, and he gets that from some details even of the Transfiguration. I consider it's also relevant when you might remember that when Peter has denied Jesus 3 times, it says Jesus is being led away, and he turned and he looked at him, and it says that Peter went out and wept bitterly. The statement that Peter went out and wept bitterly is not found in any other gospel. It's only found in the Gospel of Luke. And this is especially striking because Mark is supposedly, according to the church fathers, coming from a companion of Peter. And yet it doesn't look like Peter told Mark about going out and weeping. Or if he did, Mark decided not to record it for some reason, but he may have told Luke. So that's interesting. So Luke's being a companion of Paul puts him in a certain position. And he appears to have been a very scrupulous historical reporter. I hope after the talk tonight you will believe you have really good evidence of that. And I already said that one. You would have had the opportunity to investigate. One time especially is that there is a period of 2 years in the book of Acts when Paul is imprisoned in a town called Caesarea. That would not have been that far from you know, Jerusalem and that kind of thing for someone who was used to travel. I mean, you know, it would seem like a long way to us to walk, but it would be possible. If Luke was his companion, he's kind of hanging around. It looks like what Luke did when Paul was in prison is that he kind of stayed in the area. You know, I don't know if he would have rented a room or something. He was probably a doctor, so he just carried his medical instruments with him, and he could have set up shop or something, and then he'd have mobility too. He could go and he could visit Jerusalem and talk to people, and during a period of 2 years, that might have been when he gathered the material for the Gospel of Luke. Okay, in this presentation I'm going to describe 12 subtle external confirmations of Acts from linguistics, history, and geography. I strongly recommend the book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History by the historian, the late Colin Hemer, who was a classicist. Now, I mentioned this in an earlier video, subtle confirmations, and why they're even better than putting the names of otherwise famous people. Now, that doesn't mean it's bad to find the names of otherwise famous people, but I think you'll see tonight what I mean by subtle confirmations, because they're very hard to look up. They're very hard to check, they're very hard to research, and then that means you kind of have to be on the spot to know those things. So you didn't have to be on the spot to have heard of Herod the Great. You know, everybody had heard of Herod the Great, or Caesar Augustus, or something like that, just the way that we've heard of Queen Elizabeth. But imagine telling some detail of Queen Elizabeth's palace, or something, or of court etiquette, without being able to look it up. There is no Google at the time. Please bear that in mind. I can't tell you how important it is to remember the difficulty of research. Even if you went to a so-called library, somebody asked me one time, do you think, you know, that the author of Acts might have visited a library? A library would be like a few shelves of books, or more likely scrolls, because the codex, which is what we call a book, hadn't really gotten popular yet at that point. And I mean, that's it. It's like, oh, look, there are some books. They could be anything. Tim often likes to talk about what we have from that era, and it's like one shelf of books, okay, a shorter shelf, gotta put my hands together.
1 foot apart.
About, you know, this many books that we have left over, including a play written by Nero's pimp, and a book on agriculture. I mean, they're just sort of random, okay? And of course, a well-stocked library of the time might have had more books, but that doesn't mean you could look up this stuff. Wait till you see. When there was no Alexa, you couldn't say, hey, tell me how far of a walk it is from here to here. It was not an easy thing to know, so you had to travel to these places to find out these things. So let's start with Acts 14:11. This is during Paul's travels in Asia Minor. That would be modern-day Turkey. So if I mention Asia Minor, I'm going to mention Asia Minor a lot tonight. Think Turkey, approximately where that is. They were in a town called Lystra, and Paul began speaking to them, and Barnabas was actually, you know, helping out. You know, they're both there, and all of a sudden the people start trying to worship them as gods. Okay, I believe they performed a healing at that time. They're like, the gods have come down among us. And Paul, being a good monotheist, you know, the priest comes out and wants to sacrifice to them, and stop, etc., you know. But it specifically mentions they cried out in the Lycaonian language. The gods have become like men and have come down to us. Okay, why is this important? Well, because in the Roman Empire, people learned to speak a kind of a lingua franca. A lot of times it was Greek, what we would call Koine Greek, and the local languages were not always maintained. Sometimes you might learn to speak Latin or something like that, but a local language you might have or you might not. And Luke specifically notes that they had a local language and that was what they cried out. And we have verified the existence of a separate Lycaonian language from the mention of it in an obscure textual artifact. There really was such a thing right there. And, you know, how would Luke have known that? If he's just guessing, if he's just making stuff up, there's no reason why we should find that independently confirmed. Paul then goes over to Macedonia. So I'm doing this in approximately the order that these things appear in the book. Macedonia is, it's a crossover. It's north of Greece, and Macedonia is still there. It's still a country. And Philippi, named for Philip of Macedon, who had been a king in the BC period, was over there. So there are three little details about Philippi that we find just noted. Acts 16:12 says it was a leading city of the district and a Roman colony. Not every city in the Roman Empire was a Roman colony. To be a Roman colony was to have special status, to have a certain amount of self-governance, and so on. And so it's specifically noted about that. Well, we've confirmed that because Philippi was very pleased about that, and we have coins, hey, Philippi's a Roman colony, and Latin inscriptions and so forth from the time, with Philippi noting its own status as a Roman colony. But again, that's not something you could just look up. Hey, name me some cities that are Roman colonies in Macedonia so I can put that into my novel. There was no good way to look it up, but if you were there, you might very well hear people mention it. You might very well see inscriptions to that effect and so forth. In fact, it comes out because Paul is very outraged that they have beaten him as a Roman citizen, uncondemned, and so forth. So, you can imagine, and in a Roman colony, they did this to me, and so forth. Okay, because Paul would certainly have known. So from the circumstances of the story, Luke would have known if he's traveling with Paul, but that would not be something you could just look up. Then it mentions that on the Sabbath day, there's apparently no synagogue there, but Paul's going to worship, of course, on the Sabbath as a good Jew. So he goes out to the river, and it just says he went to the riverside outside the city gate. It doesn't name it or anything. But we can verify that there's a river called the Ganges there, and it's not like the Nile or something. It's not something that everybody had heard of. The author doesn't even mention the name. It's just, and he went out to the riverside to pray. And that's where he meets some women, and he preaches to them, because Paul is going to preach to pretty much anybody he meets. They were also there to pray to the true God. They probably were what were called God-fearers, who were Gentiles who worshiped the Jewish God, but he meets them out there. So this casualness is very important. We really need to grasp the evidential value of casualness. The author just says they went out to a riverside, and then you go and you look it up and you find out that there is a river right outside that city. Then he's not putting that in there on purpose. He's not saying, oh, somebody's going to check and see that there's a river, and then they're going to think that I'm really accurate. That's not what it looks like. It looks like he's just mentioning what he saw. And 16:14 mentions Lydia, after whom I was named by my parents, a seller of purple dye or purple fabric, and she was from Thyatira. It says she was from Thyatira. Well, if you look up Thyatira, that's a city over in Asia Minor, so that's not right there, okay? But we can independently verify that Thyatira was a center of the trade in purple dye, and so that purple trade connected Asia Minor to Macedonia. So there's no such thing as, common knowledge. Everybody knows that you get the purple dye from Thyatira and that it's traded over to Greece and there might be a woman over it. No, it's not something that everybody knows, okay? But if she introduces herself, hi, my name is Lydia, I'm from Thyatira, oh, what do? I'm a seller of purple. Then this is how it comes out very naturally in the story. Okay, so we move on to the city of Thessalonica. Once again, we're still traveling in Macedonia, and it's recounting Paul's travels. You see what I mean about the geography and how the geography allows Luke to sort of show his stuff. It allows him to show knowledge of such a wide world. So they're in the city of Thessalonica. A riot gets started, and they drag the rioters drag a believer named Jason in front of the politarchs. In most translations, you'll see that it'll be translated the city authorities. So they don't just beat them up. They're trying to get them in some kind of official trouble for preaching a foreign religion. that really is the technical term for the Board of Magistrates in Thessalonica. And it's not just a vague term. It's not just something that, like the phrase city authorities, that sounds very generic to us. The translation sounds generic, but the actual Greek term is fairly specific. It would not be common knowledge. It's exactly the sort of thing that a fictionalizer could get wrong, or if you were smart, you would just leave it vague. Maybe you'd say something that sounded more like just city authorities rather than using the specific term politarchs. But we've actually verified that from separate inscriptions. Okay, now we're kind of fast forwarding here, several chapters. We're going to be in Acts 19. Paul has traveled back over to Asia Minor, and he's in the city of Ephesus. While he's there, you may remember how this story goes if you've read the book of Acts. He's starting to have so much success as a missionary that people are leaving their pagan worship, and they're not buying statues of the goddess Athena anymore. Okay, and so the silversmith gets upset, and he gathers some people together, and he says, we're going to lose our money, we're going to lose our trade. This is having economic consequences for us. It had just recounted how the people who had been to the occult came and they burned their magic books and so forth. So he's really having a great ministry among the Gentiles, and it's starting to affect them economically. So they start a huge riot. And it's probably the biggest riot described in Acts. By the way, I think Luke really likes riots. Luke, I like to say he's the writer of action. He likes court scenes, riots, travel, not so interested in theology. It's not to say that his theology is wrong, but it's just to say that his interest, he's got the eye of an action writer. And so they started a huge riot to where they gathered, thousands of people together, and they all gathered into the theater, and they're screaming, "Great is Diana, goddess of the Ephesians! Great is Diana, goddess of the Ephesians!" It even has a sort of a humorous little note in there that says many of them didn't even know why they were rioting. They didn't even know why they had come together. They just kind of got swept up in it, which is very realistic. Okay, so Acts 19:35, someone it has a certain amount of courage, I think it would take, to try to calm them down. Especially, remember, there's no megaphones or anything. This guy has to yell, and they're yelling, So he stands up and he's trying to calm the crowd because he's very concerned. Rome did not like riots. Rome wanted people to stay peaceful, okay? So they call him the town clerk. That's how it's usually translated. And the Greek word is grammateus, and it did in fact designate a magistrate in Ephesus. This is attested in the inscriptions. In all of these verses I've listed here, the rioting crowd and the town clerk refer to Great Artemis, sometimes translated Diana, Great Artemis. This phrase, the great goddess Artemis, is testified in Ephesus from inscriptions. So that's how they referred to her, Great Artemis. And that's what they're screaming, great is Artemis, goddess of the Ephesians. And he stands up and says, everyone knows that we serve the great Artemis. Nobody's insulting Artemis. Calm down, And so that was a common phrase. Once again, 1935, he says, it's known that the city of Ephesus is the guardian of the temple. So again, he's telling them, you guys don't have to have a religious riot to prove your religious fervor. Your religious fervor is well known. And so that phrase, the guardian of the temple, is also attested in inscriptions that Ephesus was the guardian of the temple to Artemis. And then he also says the courts are in session. So he's saying instead of rioting, if the silversmiths have some kind of complaint, they could bring it to court. They could do this legally, okay? And there really was a regular court session that the Romans did in Asia Minor, in principal cities, which would have included Ephesus. They would hold regular courts. We think of how easy it is to bring a lawsuit, but of course then, somebody had to travel and be there and hold the courts. But the Romans made sure to do that. So he's like, there's an opportunity. You can bring a court case, and we can verify separately that was true. They would have had the opportunity to bring a court case. All right, So I'm going to move on to Acts 20. After this riot, Paul leaves, and he's going to go to Jerusalem at this point. And kind of a long way around. He goes to Jerusalem, doesn't go immediately. In fact, he goes up. Well, yeah, he really takes a long way around. He goes up, he goes down through Greece, and then eventually he's going to go to Jerusalem. But when he comes around in Acts 20, 13 through 14, he's in Asia Minor on his way to Jerusalem. And so it says, this is one of the we passages, we went ahead to the ship, and Paul was going to walk, and we were going to meet him in Assos. And I'm going to have a map here in a minute. Okay, so his friends go to the ship, and he says, you know what, I'm going to walk it. I'm going to pick me up. Now remember, they don't own this ship. All right, they're just buying the equivalent of a ticket. You know, it's not as though they have somebody who's gonna do whatever they tell him to. They're assuming it's probably a coasting vessel, that it's gonna ride around and it's gonna pick them up. So let me go to the map here. All right, there's Troas, there's Assos. This is the tip of Asia Minor. You can find this, it's called Cape Lectum, sometimes called Cape Baba. And he's walking from Troas to Assos. But if you think about this, you can ask a question, wouldn't the ship sail faster? You know, if he's walking and the ship is sailing, it's got the wind and it sails and so forth, and he can't expect the ship to just wait for it, right? I mean, if you're walking someplace and you're telling your friends, you take the Greyhound bus or you take the train and just wait for me, I'll get there eventually. Of course the bus isn't going to wait. Of course the train isn't going to wait. So why isn't there a problem here? Well, now if he went directly, I'm going to go back actually to the map. If he went directly, as the crow flies right across, it's about 20 miles. Now, we don't know if he could go directly. We don't know if there was a road. It's been pointed out to me that some maps of the Roman road actually go by the coast, which would be about 31 miles. But, you know, he can just keep walking, okay? But the ship has to go around the cape, and this is called Cape Lectum, and it would be somewhat adverse as far as the weather conditions. They have to tack around carefully so they don't just get smashed, okay? And they have to do this somewhat carefully for safety. So presumably there would be time for Paul to walk while the ship is going around, so the ship doesn't get there first and have to wait for him, and you know, maybe he would miss it or his friends would have to get off, and so it can be timed properly. Okay, so because it's what's called a cape, it's something that the ship has to go around, especially a sailing vessel, kind of carefully. So that's kind of cool. But it fits with those local geographical conditions. And all that Luke says is, you know, this is what we did. He walked and we took the ship and we picked him up at Assos. All right, so let's talk about a different place called Patara. In Acts 21:1, this is again in the middle of a we passage. He's continuing to give this blow-by-blow account of this last trip to Jerusalem. And he says, we found a ship at Patara that was sailing across to, it would be Phoenicia, it would be near Tyre. You sometimes hear references to Tyre in the Gospels. It's pretty far north. Let me just show that map there. And there's that route. And this really would make sense. Patara was a port. It was used in the corn trade. The corn trade is very important. You know, we kind of take some of this for granted, though during COVID we've actually had to face some of these supply chain issues. Much of the grain in the ancient Roman Empire came from Africa. It came from Alexandria. Alexandria was the corn basket of the Roman Empire, and so ships were very important because they're bringing this grain a long way. And if you wanted to be a passenger, you would often get on a grain ship and travel. And so this port really was used in the corn trade, and it would have been pretty easy and plausible to find a ship headed the way they wanted to go toward Jerusalem. Even more striking, the name is neuter plural. Now, I just want to mention the origin of this name is obscure. It may mean baskets, but then again, it may not. But it is in a neuter plural form. Acts gives the exact right form of the town's name, which is attested in inscriptions. Now, that's just remarkable. When we think about that, I just love that. You know, I mean, how's he going to know the exact right form of the town's name? Again, it's not something you can look up. Okay, now I want to talk about a little island called Cauda out in the Mediterranean. And we're going to fast forward yet again. Paul is on his way to Rome. He's a prisoner. He's been, captured in a sense, but actually the Romans sort of have him under protective custody because some of the Jewish opponents in Jerusalem, again, rioted, tried to kill him. The Romans actually rescued him, and now he's appealed to Caesar, partly in order to keep on having that protection of the Romans. Because, as I think I may have mentioned in an earlier lecture, if anyone was going to kill you and you were a Roman citizen, the Romans wanted it to be the Romans who killed you, not someone else. They were going to keep you protected until you had the process of law if you were a Roman citizen, and Paul was a Roman citizen. So they're taking him to Rome. A Roman citizen had the right to appeal to Caesar. And we get quite a blow-by-blow description of that voyage. There's an entire book called the Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul, and it's on Tim's website, the Library of Historical Apologetics, historicalapologetics.org, and it's great. It was this 19th century guy. He owned a yacht. He was a sailor, not a poor sailor, kind of a well-off sailor. He owned a yacht named Smith, and he actually knew all kinds of things, and he picked out all these great little details from this voyage that makes sense to him as a sailor. And he even notices the fact that the author appears not to have been a sailor, and yet he notices things that a sailor understands. So it's like a landsman who's like, I wonder why they're doing that, and he's just writing it down, and a sailor reading it understands why they were doing it. It's such a mark of truth. In Acts 27:14 through 16, they've been on the island of Crete, which is in the Mediterranean, and Paul says, let's just wait here for the winter. So even though he's a prisoner, Paul is very assertive. I was reading this with my 17-year-old daughter recently, and she said, that's right, he's still a prisoner, because you almost forget he's a prisoner as you read these chapters, because he's always telling them what to do, and he'll say to them, you should have taken my advice if it doesn't turn out right. I mean, Paul is he's got so much self-confidence. So he told them to spend the winter there, and they say, no, this isn't a good place to spend the winter. We're going to try to go on the coast a little way and spend the winter at a different city. And this does not work out well at all, because the winter storms are just beginning, and they get caught by a northeastern wind, a great windstorm out of the northeast. It calls it in the King James a tempestuous wind named Euroclydon. So it's what they call a northeaster. And they find a brief refuge next to an island called Cauda or Clauda. It doesn't help them for very long. It's not like they try to land there. They just kind of get out of the wind a little bit for a short time. Here's a map. Okay, so here is Crete, and the blow up here. They were at Fair Havens. That's where Paul said we should spend the winter, and they did not listen to him. And as they came out from behind that little point of land, wham! They got hit by the northeasters. So northeasters coming out of the northeast, right? So it's going to drive you this way. Okay, it's going to drive you this way. And indeed, boom, there's Cauda. They're driven that way. They end up under the lee of the island. They were aiming for Phoenix. They wanted to spend the winter there instead. Maybe it was just a nicer city or something. But they're blown off course, and they end up under the lee of Cauda, which is where you would get blown to by a northeaster. This is great, I just love this. Other ancient authors, such as Pliny the Elder in his Natural History, place Cauda in the wrong location. Literally the wrong location. Also in a location that would not fit what Acts is describing. You would not be blown there by a strong northeastern wind. But Acts describes both accurately where it was and also the location that would fit the events in Acts. Okay, and I researched these details when I was reading up on this after I had read this detail in Wenham, and it really is true. I mean, the other ancient authors are like placing it too far west or too far east, like where it really didn't exist there. Okay, so Acts author could not, even if he'd read Pliny's Natural History, which was in existence by that time, he could not have gotten this fact from there. It's just so cool. All right, so those are my 12 facts. Now I want to talk a little bit about the skeptical scholar Bart Ehrman. There are more of these, by the way. I mean, you know, that's just, I picked 12, okay, but there are more, okay? The skeptical scholar Bart Ehrman actually wrote a blog post just this fall, so this is timely. It was dated October 4th. And he stated that, and he kind of downplayed specifically Hemer's book and the very kinds of evidences that I have been giving you here tonight. He said it is totally irrelevant. And it's just sort of jaw-dropping. I think when you hear a presentation like this, we realize intuitively that this is highly relevant, okay? And he also said that it would be relevant if they got these things wrong, but that it is totally irrelevant if they get them right. Double standard? Very definitely. And in fact, I can tell you as a probability theorist that these two statements of Ehrman's are impossible to have both true at the same time. Something can't be totally irrelevant if it's right, but relevant if it's wrong. You can't have both of those be the case. Well, okay, let's try to be charitable to Dr. Ehrman. Maybe he was exaggerating. Maybe he really meant that it's scarcely relevant, hardly helpful, mostly irrelevant, or something like that. Well, is that true either? Why should you think that? It certainly seems that getting these specific details accurate shows us that the author had probably traveled to these places and noticed these things connected with the events. Now, Ehrman believes in the existence of Paul. It's not like he's a Paul denier or something. He believes that Paul existed. He believes that Paul traveled. Why should these not be the record of Paul's journeys? Notice that I haven't mentioned a single miracle here tonight. All right, every single thing I've talked about has just been about these guys traveling around, right? They're going from one city to another. There are riots. There's this, there's that. They get on a ship. They're in a storm. Okay, where is this problem coming in with taking these to be accurate descriptions of the travels of St. Paul? Ehrman must be assuming that we already know in some independent way that Acts is not accurate. All right, but that it is highly realistic. Now, if we already knew that in some other way, and we could just take that as a given, then right, these details wouldn't make a difference. So when I read novels, and I already know, and they say right up front, a novel, and I also know that the author's pretty good at researching things and so forth, but I know it's a novel, then of course if someone comes to me and says, hey, look, she got the name of this king's brother correct, I'm going to say, well, yeah, I already knew it was a historical novel, right? So that doesn't change my estimate of the possibility or the probability that everything happened the way that she describes it in other respects, because I already know that it's historical fiction. But why should we think that we already know that Acts is not a true story? We don't already know that. That, in fact, is just exactly the question at issue, isn't it? Whether Acts is telling true events. So Ehrman, on pain of circularity, doesn't get to assume that he already knows that Acts is, it's really realistic, but it's fictional. He can't take that to be just a given. What would it be like for Acts not to be true history. And I think we need to think this through in connection with the kinds of details I've been talking about here tonight and what would be involved. Well, first of all, the author had to somehow gather all of these obscure details, right? He had to have them at hand. Ehrman sometimes says that maybe he was a traveler, or maybe he got a hold of a travel document from someone else. I mean, we have no such evidence, but it's just conjecture. You know, he got a hold of some kind of travel document, or he had actually traveled there, but then he's just pretending to be the companion of Paul, because Ehrman doesn't believe he was the companion of Paul. Then he invented some travels for Paul and then pretended that he was his companion. And he was just like really good at this. He was very subtle, and he scattered these little subtle details that he had separately gathered throughout the story. And in this way, he invented a genre that did not exist otherwise at the time. He invented it for himself, namely highly realistic historical fiction. And then he created a hoax by pretending that this was real history. And you remember, he's got a preface to Luke, and then he's got a preface to Acts, written to someone named Theophilus, a friend of his, saying, "This is so you may be assured of the truth of what you've been taught." Theophilus was evidently a new convert to Christianity, and he had been taught Christianity. It's like, this is to give you confidence, but evidently that was baloney. Okay, so he did that. And then he sent it to someone who probably hadn't traveled to all of these places himself, and therefore probably didn't know all of these details, and therefore he wouldn't even be impressed. Because it would be hard enough for one person to gather all of these highly obscure details. It's even less likely that a given audience member, any given audience member, would know these details in order to go, "Ooh, wow, he must really be telling the truth." You know, we ourselves, even with the tools of modern research, have only gathered these gradually. That's part of why Hemer's book is such a wonderful compendium, that he put all this stuff together. Now, this is incredibly implausible. This is incredibly improbable. So what else? Well, Ehrman thinks that Acts was written in the 80s. Now, I think it was probably written in the early 60s. Ehrman thinks it was written a good 20-some years later, which would be well after Paul's epistles were written. But Ehrman thinks it contradicts Paul's epistles. In fact, if you asked him why he thinks that Acts is not factual, why you think it's false, riddled with contradictions with Paul's epistles. Now, I believe these are contrived. They're easily resolved. They're not really contradictions. But that's not where I'm going. Here's where I'm going. What kind of a hoaxer is this? We're imagining a guy who can go research obscure details of geography and language and find out that there's a Lycaonian language and that this is where Cauda is and all this stuff. And he couldn't even be bothered to go read these letters from this famous Christian Paul, whom he's pretending to be the companion of, and make sure that he doesn't put in anything that appears to contradict them. That's not even a consistent picture of the kind of author we're imagining. It's like a schizophrenic author. So that doesn't make sense as a theory, even on its own terms. What's the real picture we have of Acts? Well, Luke appears to be a careful historian. He appears to be a real companion of Paul. He gets hard things right, and then he reports them casually as they come up in his story. So we need to remember this big picture when we think about the book of Acts. What does this really look like? So, if there are questions in the Q&A about specific alleged contradictions between Acts and Paul's epistles, I'm happy to address those for sure. But when we look at all of the hard things that Acts gets right, and of course there are many more, it sets those against that background. And what it really shows is the independence of the book of Acts from the epistles. In fact, I don't believe that the author of Acts had read Paul's epistles at all. I think I've mentioned he does not strike me as a man who was really all that interested in theological matters. And So he's actually recounting the events as he knew them and as he saw them. And even the appearance of apparent contradiction tends to confirm that. Now, if I may recommend my own book, we were actually joking before the live stream started tonight about Bart Ehrman saying, buy my book, okay? But if you're interested in these subjects, buy my book. Specifically Hidden in Plain View, like I said at the beginning, it has a whole half of it, which is on Acts and the Pauline epistles. They actually fit together amazingly well, just so well. In fact, I've often said I can place several of Paul's epistles to within the verse in the book of Acts when they must have been written. This must have been written in Acts, right at the time represented by Acts 19:21. This must have been written right at the time represented by Acts 20 verse 3, etc. Even though the book of Acts never mentions that Paul wrote an epistle. Now, it's just by these little coincidences and that you can see, okay, those must be the surrounding circumstances in these subtle, indirect ways. So actually, the epistles are not an embarrassment for the book of Acts. The epistles of Paul are actually a great strengthening of the book of Acts, but I didn't have time to get to that tonight because I was trying to give the external evidence. And then generally on these topics, the mirror or the mask, liberating the Gospels from literary devices, and specifically concerning Acts, there's a chapter in there and a section in there on the speeches in the book of Acts. Because you will see scholars saying, the speeches in the book of Acts are all too much alike, because they sometimes will refer to the same scripture verse or that kind of thing. I think Luke was making them up, basically. These are all just kind of Luke's invention. And so I have a whole section on the speeches in Acts in my book on the Gospels to show the scrupulousness that Luke had, even as a recorder of the spoken word and even as a recorder of what we might think of as, lengthy speeches. Here's my contact info. Again, LydiaMcGrew.com is my website. Follow my public content on Facebook. Email questions, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'm trying to put out a lot of new content on that YouTube channel. Now, I have some bonuses here. So I can go to the bonuses, but I imagine there are questions coming in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually leave up the contact information for right now, and then we'll go to Q&A. And then if that just kind of fills out the time, cool. If there's a lull or something, maybe I'll go and do some of the bonuses. So let's go to Q&A right now.
Can we clap? Are there any questions in the physical room?
Jasmine.
Hello, everyone. My question is if you have a friend that's a skeptic of the Bible, how do you which part, I know we were speaking about Acts tonight, so which parts do you recommend if you have a friend that's a skeptic of the Bible to review? Because say they are atheists or they just don't believe.
Where should you start?
Where should you start? Yes.
Yeah. I think X could be a really great place to start. It depends on your skeptic friend, and if you know that person and you know he's likely to like this kind of stuff that I gave him tonight, then you could definitely start here. If he's into science or he's into hard fact, geography, and that kind of thing, I think the Book of Acts could definitely put what they call a stone in his shoe. To make him uncomfortable and to say, I wonder, especially when you tell him, and guess what? This same author wrote the book of Luke, which tells all about the life of Jesus and how Jesus rose from the dead and stuff, and look how careful he was, and look how he seems to have been on the spot. It's entirely possible that your friend is going to have no idea that there's this much evidence that there was a book written by a person who was this close to the facts. People like Bart Ehrman will say we have no idea who wrote the Gospels. And he'll greatly exaggerate that idea that they were written long after, and we don't know who wrote them, and that they don't represent first-person testimony and so forth. This type of presentation challenges all of this. What I used to say is there's a road marked, legend and invention, and the skeptics want to drive their vehicle down that road. And the great thing about Acts is it's like a great big tree that's fallen across the road. You can't go through that road of legend and that road of just invented, made up history, because Acts blocks the way. So, if he's the type of person who's likely to like this kind of thing, you can give that a shot and start here, for sure. Anybody else in the room? Okay, Kevin.
I was just wondering if you could elaborate on a couple of the apparent contradictions that an airman would raise.
Sure. Actually, did I put one in my bonus here? No. Okay, I didn't. Yeah, I'll give one or two. So, one of them concerns the story several of them concern the story that Paul gives in the book of Galatians about his early life as a Christian. And so Paul says that after 3 years, he went to Jerusalem. So, 3 years after he became a Christian, he went to Jerusalem. And so then Aaron goes over to the book of Acts, chapter 9. It tells about Paul's conversion, and it talks about how he was in Damascus after his conversion. And then it says, after many days, there was a plot to kill him and so forth. And they let him down with a basket out of the wall. And as a matter of fact, Paul mentions that same incident in another one of his epistles, how they let him down in a basket to get away. But Ehrman will say, see, it says it was just a short time. In other words, he'll say that that's a contradiction because in Acts, it doesn't say that it was 3 years. It says after many days. Okay, well, so the idea is that after many days probably just means, a couple months, or something. You're kind of guessing what that expression means. Well, the interesting thing is you can go to the Old Testament. Now it's a different language, originally written, in Hebrew, but we also have it in Greek in the Septuagint Greek version. After many days, just some stories they're telling, and it turns out it's 3 years. Now, I'm not saying that after many days specifically means 3 years. That's not my point. But what I'm saying is that it can mean 3 years. All right. In other words, it's just this very generic, like we would say after a long time or after a while or something. And what we're doing is we're kind of taking our modern notion that many days must just mean, a short time. And so that's a very manufactured kind of contradiction. A lot of them are arguments from silence. So in that same location, Paul says he went to Arabia, and apparently he had mystical visions while he was in Arabia. And he went away to Arabia for a while, and then returned to Damascus. And Acts this is in that 3 year period. That's during that period. Acts doesn't mention the journey to Arabia. So again, Ehrman tries to make a contradiction out of that because he doesn't mention it. That's an example. There are also things like the emphasis that Paul makes on not receiving his gospel from any human being, Whereas in Acts, so these again are sort of differences of emphasis. In Acts, he goes and he meets the apostles and so forth. He seems to, be glad to have their approval. And so then this is supposed to be like a contradiction, that he seems more independent in the epistles. That kind of thing. These little differences of emphasis, a lot is made out of them. Sometimes a contradiction will be made out of the fact that we're simply not sure how to fit the details together, even when they don't actually contradict each other. So, for example, in Galatians 2, so we're still in Galatians, he's still telling the story of his life. He mentions a visit to Jerusalem where he met Peter and he met James and so forth. And we're not sure which visit to Jerusalem that is over in the book of Acts. And there's actually a big scholarly controversy about it. And in fact, it may even be a visit to Jerusalem that isn't mentioned in Acts. Acts doesn't necessarily have to be telling about all the visits to Jerusalem. But that's the kind of thing that Ehrman will glom onto and say it's a contradiction, whereas really it's an uncertainty about, which of the visits this might be. So these are the kinds of things where the way he'll state them will make them sound like contradictions, but they're really not. That's a sampler. Some people in the Q&A may bring up other examples possibly. I don't know, Tom's maybe waiting to spring one on me here, but go ahead.
Oh, not quite yet. Aaron Wenger is asking, how is it that Acts isn't an integral part of the debate surrounding the rest of the New Testament? And he follows up and says, I don't usually hear it brought up, only discrepancies between the Gospels or the quote-unquote yuckiness of Paul as arguments against Christianity.
The yuckiness of what?
Of Paul.
Oh, like he's a harsh person?
I suppose so, yeah.
That kind of thing. Okay, so why isn't it brought up more often? Is that the question? I have no idea.
Next question.
Next question. No, I mean, it really should be, and I think maybe the best answer is sociological. Tim did a debate with Bart Ehrman on the Unbelievable show that you can find if you go out there and you look it up. They were talking about undesigned coincidences in the debate. Ehrman had clearly not prepared. I think if you listen to it, you can tell that Ehrman did not prep for undesigned coincidences. He appeared completely uninformed about them, even though that had been the announced topic of the debate. It was very interesting. In fact, Ehrman took it to the topic of the authorship of the Gospels very early on. It was a two-part debate. Almost the entire first part, they ended up talking about the authorship. Fortunately, Tim had prepared, and Tim being Tim, he just has a great memory, even better than mine. But he was able to debate the authorship of the Gospels, even though that was not the topic that he had prepared for. It was amazing, because that's a topic that Bart feels comfortable with. That's his wheelhouse. When in the second part, the host, Justin Brierley, actually moved it out. He's like, let's talk about undesigned coincidences, because that's supposedly what we're going to talk about. What Ehrman said was, it sounds like some kind of 19th century argument. So it sounds like some kind of 19th century apologetic. And that was just supposed to take care of it. It's 19th century. Moving on, sheer chronological snobbery. And I think some of that plays into this concerning Acts as well. That it is, you know what? It sounds 19th century because it is 19th century. Man, those guys were good. Let's do more 19th century, apologists and 18th century as well. Actually, a wonderful book on this is from the 1700s. So that's going back even earlier, called the Horai Paulini, written by William Paley. In fact, it was that book on Acts and the Epistles that got me into undesigned coincidences. Even before I got into them on the Gospels, I had to take a train journey on the Amtrak, and Tim went out and he printed and spiral bound a little copy of Paley's Horai Paulini. I still have it. This would have been in 2014, and he gave it to me to read on the train. And I came back and I was just completely sold on the argument from undesigned coincidences from reading that book, and and that's where he coined the word undesigned coincidences. So it is an old argument, and I think there's a certain amount of snobbery about that. I'm afraid we don't want to sound like we're doing that. Tim has a comment. Go ahead.
You mentioned in the course of your talk that you've selected 12 pieces of evidence from a much larger body. Can you just give people who might not be familiar with that some sense of how much larger, how many facts we're looking at in terms of Hemer's work or other work, Smith's work, things like that?
I've never tried to count, and I'm bad at that sort of thing, but I do know there are 20 pages in Hemer, and the print's not all that big, 20 pages in Hemer that are just called Other Types of Knowledge Displayed in the Book of Acts. And I think most of mine tonight came from there. And you just read through. And the thing about Hemer is he sometimes states them kind of briefly. And so sometimes you kind of wait, that one passed kind of fast. And so he manages to pack a lot into those 20 pages because he doesn't go on at length about them like I did here tonight. And that's just those 20 pages. Then there's another chapter on, I think it's proper names in Acts. There's another section on undesigned coincidences. So, you know, just pages and pages and pages just in that book. I find that just sitting there and reading them and pondering and coming to understand them, my faith is strengthened tremendously. So, I don't know, you probably have a better sense than I do. I would say dozens at least.
I think in those 20 pages, there are somewhere between 80 and 100 specific facts,
Could
and
very
that's
well
just in those 20-some
just
pages.
in those 20 pages. So it's amazing. Do we have more?
Yeah, we have a comment in the chat that says, quote, "I want the bonuses."
Okay, here we go. I got two tonight. So here we go. Bonus one. Acts 22:28. Paul has just been rescued from the rioters by the Romans. You don't usually think of the Romans as the Roman soldiers as the heroes of the day, but Paul was getting the tar beaten out of him by the rioters down at the temple precincts. And the Romans looked down from above. Evidently their fortress, probably the Fortress Antonia, was up high enough that they could look down into the temple, and they're like, shoot, they're rioting. And so down they go. And it says they came down specifically, so those would be like the stairs from the fortress. And they rescue him. And the Romans were funny this way. If they found that other people were beating you up, they really didn't like it, and they assumed you had done something to provoke it. And so they were likely to beat you up themselves. Now, we actually find this with Jesus. Pilate says, your own countrymen have turned you over to me. What have you done? And then it says Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. So, and he's sort of hoping to calm them down. See, I beat him. He's bleeding. You know, can I let him go? Because he didn't want to kill him. I mean, they have very strange ideas of mercy and so forth. So they rescue him. But then they're like, we want to find out why they were beating him. Scourge him to find out why they were beating him. So they've got him like chained up, and they're tied up, and they're gonna scourge him. And he says, is it lawful to scourge a Roman citizen uncondemned? Okay. The answer to that, in case you were wondering, is no. In fact, you could get into huge trouble for scourging a Roman citizen uncondemned. That's one reason why Paul really scares the tar out of the officials in Philippi, because they apparently beat him too quickly for him to get a chance to say this. We're not going to let that happen again. So they stop. They go to the leader, the commander, and they say, be careful what you do. This man is a Roman citizen. So he comes and he says to Paul, are you a Roman citizen? Now notice, there is no ID. Nobody carries ID around then. So of course it would be very convenient to claim to be a Roman citizen when you weren't, obviously, to prevent yourself from getting beaten. And how would you prove it? So they had to be pretty good at sort of interrogation, kind of judging whether a man was telling the truth or not, or whatever, in order to judge how to proceed. So he's just going to question him. And Paul says yes. And so the centurion says to him, with a great price, I bought this freedom. So he's saying, I'm a Roman citizen too, and I paid for it. He had paid money for it. Okay. He says he only became a citizen by paying a lot of money. Paul says, I was born free. It's a great moment. It's a great dramatic moment in the book. For because it's kind of a higher status to be born free than to have had to purchase your citizenship. So Paul is unfazed by the amount of money that this guy spent for his citizenship. We have been able to confirm from Dio Cassius that citizenships were sold at the time of the Emperor Claudius. That was at this time. Moreover, the price went down. So at first, it was more expensive, and then later Claudius needed more money, so he sold them cheaper to get more money. And so you can imagine how the centurion is thinking, oh, are you one of those guys who came along and got Roman citizenship on the cheap? After people like me, we had to pay a lot. So he's sneering at him, okay? Although he's still not going to beat him, of course, but he's leering at that situation, and then Paul just one-ups him and says, but I was born free. But it's this wonderful little confirmation, so indirect, of this little bit of dialogue that just goes on between Paul and the centurion, which probably Luke had witnessed. So there's one bonus. There's a bonus. This is actually an undesigned coincidence. In Galatians 1:17, Paul says, I returned once more to Damascus. This is after going away to Arabia. So this is in the very place that I was explaining in answer to Kevin's question. It's taken to be a contradiction because of the after many days in Acts, which, Ehrman says doesn't sound like very long, and Paul says, that after 3 years he went up to Jerusalem. This is right there, but it's actually a connection. I returned once more to Damascus. In Galatians, Paul has not mentioned Damascus before. He mentions his conversion. He describes that God appeared to him, but he doesn't say, I was on the way to Damascus. He hasn't mentioned Damascus yet. But he says, I went away after I was called, I went away to Arabia, and I returned again to Damascus. So he's implying he'd been in Damascus, but it's this indirect way of implying it, okay? Why return to Damascus? If you just read that bit of, chapter in Galatians, it's like, you were in Damascus before? You were in Damascus already? You just kind of infer that in an indirect way. That, of course, fits beautifully with Acts 9, which is that he was on, as we call it, the Damascus Road. He was on the road to Damascus when he had his big conversion experience and the light and everything. And then he goes to Damascus. He's blind, you remember? He's been blinded by that light, and he regains his sight while he's there. He's baptized and so forth. So he's been in Damascus. Then Galatians tells us he went to Arabia briefly, and then it says, and I returned again to Damascus. So it's this indirect language that shows that actually Paul is acknowledging in Galatians 1 that he actually went to Damascus pretty much immediately after his conversion, but he's acknowledging it in an indirect way. It doesn't look at all like Acts is based upon the Galatians, not at all. In fact, no doubt, if Acts were based on Galatians, the author would have mentioned the 3-year period instead of using such a vague phrase as after many days, which is taken to indicate something, modern scholars think that creates a discrepancy. He would have gone to more trouble to fit them together. And yet, even though they appear to be independent, they actually do fit together. And that's just one of many that I give in the second half of Hidden in Plain View. So, do we have more questions?
How much are undesigned coincidences used in assessing the reliability of other historical documents, not the Gospels?
Well, Tim has a bunch of ones, again, from the 19th century. They probably were actually getting the term from gospel scholarship at the time, where they actually did use the term. I don't know, how many of you put together 12
yeah,
or so?
well, about a dozen in an afternoon of looking.
Yeah, but let me also mention, assessing historical documents is maybe not even the place where you would find it most. I would say assessing witness testimony in legal contexts and in criminal investigation may be an even more common place. So, and I apologize if I'm repeating myself. I think I may have said this a few weeks ago. I'm rereading the book Witness by Whittaker Chambers right now. He was a former spy who testified against communist infiltration that he, of course, had knowledge of as a spy during the Cold War in 1948. And there was a man named Alger Hiss who had been one of his closest friends in the Communist Party. Hiss tried to deny even knowing Chambers at first. He tried to say that he didn't even know him. And then he finally came around to admitting that he had known him, but tried to say he hadn't been his friend and so forth. The committee, this was a congressional committee, questioned them separately. And they just kind of got them talking, because there was this question, have you known one another? Did you know one another? Because at first that That was the question. Then other questions, of course, arose from that, but were you friends? Because Chambers said they had been close friends. So they just got him talking, what were his nicknames? Did he have a dog? What were his hobbies, etc.? Did he have a car? What was his car like, etc.? And they just kind of got him talking. And then they got his separately, and they were, what were your nicknames? Did you have a dog? Did you have a car? What was your car like, etc.? And they just got him talking. And the undesigned coincidences are, well, they're just amazing. And of course, nobody uses the word undesigned coincidences, but here's one of the most striking. They asked Chambers, again, they didn't know who was lying. They knew one of them had to be lying, but they didn't know which one it was. So they said, did he have any hobbies? And he said, yeah, bird watching. He was an avid bird watcher. And he said, I remember one time I met him, and he was very excited because he had seen a prothonotary warbler here on the Potomac. Is that how you pronounce that? River Potomac? Anyway, they're in Maryland, near Washington, D.C. And he had seen a prothonotary warbler, which was a rare bird. He was all excited. So Chambers just tells that little story. So one of the committee members was also a bird watcher, and he knew this was a very rare bird. So they get his talking, and they're like, what are your hobbies? And he said, bird watching and tennis. I'll come back to tennis in a minute, but he goes, bird watching and tennis. And so they get him talking, and one of the committee members just quietly says to him, you ever seen a prothonotary warbler? Yes, I did. And he gets all excited. Have you ever seen one? Right here. They come back and they nest. A beautiful bird. It's amazing. He gets all excited. And it said, there was sort of a hush in the committee. And Chambers says it was at that moment that I think it was the chairman of the committee became convinced. The man who said that, which was Chambers, had known Alger Hiss because of the prothonotary warbler. So it's one of the most famous birds in Cold War history. And as far as the tennis is concerned, it's amazing because it seemed like it was a contradiction. It would be a very trivial one, but they said to Chambers, did he have any other hobbies? Because he didn't mention, anything but bird watching at first. And he said, no, I don't really remember any other hobbies. And you might think, aha, this is a contradiction because he doesn't remember any other hobbies, and his says tennis as well as bird watching. But they kept him talking. They just asked all kind of questions. They said, was he interested in athletics at all? And he said, oh, I believe he played tennis. So it turned out that, there was no contradiction. It was just a matter of whether you called it a hobby or not. So he actually did know that he played tennis as well as bird watching. And there were a lot of these wonderfully subtle confirmations. He mentions his car, and he says, and I remember it had the kind of windshield wipers that you had to work by hand, because I borrowed his car one time. Can you guys imagine having windshield wipers? You literally had to keep doing it, and because it rained, and I had to do them by hand. So they're talking to his separately. What kind of car did you have at this time? And he names it. It's the same kind of car. And what kind of windshield wipers did it have? The kind you had to, work by hand. So even though they're asking him the questions, of course his has no desire to confirm Chambers' testimony. And in fact, probably he didn't have. He complained bitterly again and again. Why haven't you given me his testimony? It's because, dude, the whole point is we're trying to see whether the two of you independently, agree with each other. It's obvious, But even if he had it, the last thing he would have wanted to do would be to confirm it, because he was trying to deny that they had even known one another at that time. So it really looks like he didn't have it. But he keeps on saying things that that agree even in these indirect ways. So I would say that's where you want to look for it, even more than in history, is in witness statement analysis and so forth. You have any more?
No, I don't think so. One more round of applause
Cool.
for Dr. McGrew.
Thanks, everyone. Stay tuned to our social media pages for posting of these lectures, and then also